Hello, wonderful Region 2 flutists. This is a tutorial highlighting the 2020 technical etude for our region auditions. This particular work is a new composition, so we have a little bit of a journey and project in coming up with a kind of stylistic interpretation for this work, and also the slower, the more lyrical work. This particular piece, what I did was I actually cut it in three different portions. I put a Roman numeral number 1 at the first measure, Roman numeral number 2 at the 17th measure, which is really the development. And then there's a recapitulation, rather short recapitulation, or a review of what happened in the beginning, and that is in measure 41. And I put a Roman numeral next to that, that's number 3. So similar to the lyrical etude, this one has some challenging dynamic changes, wide sweeping dynamics actually. And I've already written these dynamic changes in. I've circled some things. I've put some extra crescendo markings in to help. You do have a subito dynamic area. Put this in yellow. Subito dynamic area in measure 16. Forte, dotted quarter note to a piano. The good thing about that area is that you'll be taking a breath. That's the pickup into the development area. I've used dash line markings in some cases. If we look at measure 25 as an example, I'm using dash line markings just to help out with reminding you that it is maintaining a piano dynamic until something changes, and in this particular case it changes. In measure 29, end of 29, I would say, crescendo through 30, 31, and then arrival in 32 with the mezzo forte. You have another subito dynamic, measure 33, from a mezzo forte to a mezzo piano. In some cases, I rewrote some of the dynamics, especially if you have long time dynamic, where you're maintaining a steady dynamic. For example, measure 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, and then you have a crescendo. I've rewritten the mezzo piano just as a reminder, just so you don't forget where you're going to go, just so there's no crescendo or decrescendos that are happening. So from the standpoint of breath marks, you have an awful lot of staccatos in here. You also have some dotted eighth notes to 16th notes. And a good rule of thumb to keep when breathing is to separate the dotted eighth note from its 16th note counterpart. And the reason for that is because the 16th note acts as a pickup. So you have that in measure 2, you have that in measure 4. End of the first very, very, very long phrase, long statement would be at 8, and certainly a breath mark could work at the end of measure 8 after the quarter note. Measure 10, dotted eighth note to 16th note. Measure 12, yet again, and then at 16, that would be your last big breath mark in that first large chapter, if you would. In the development section, which is the section at 17, you still have staccatos that you certainly could breathe after. Measure 20, you have a dotted eighth note to 16th note rhythmic idea. You have some longer notes. Measure 24, certainly you could take a breath there. Long notes don't always indicate the end of a phrase, but it certainly does in this particular case. You also have a dynamic change at 25 that could help you with that. Starting from measure 26, you have this unusual 3-slur arpeggiated pattern in 26. You have it again in 28. And then you have a restatement of that in 36. Certainly you could take a breath if you needed one in 26, 28, and then in 36 you have two notes of the same exact note name next to each other. It's sometimes good to characterize those a little bit differently by putting a breath mark in between. Same thing in 34. I would absolutely separate those so that they don't sound like just one note. You do have a couple of dotted eighth, actually it's maybe just one. Measure 37, a dotted eighth note to a 16th note, but this one is, he's got it textured with a slur, so I didn't, in my recording, I didn't actually separate those. And then in your third section, it goes right back to what you did in the very, very beginning, plus a couple of extra dotted eighth note to 16th notes. And then in measure 49, you have this rising pattern, rising scale pattern actually. I would take a breath after the high D natural so you have enough breath to make it through. A slurred staccato in measure 50, so you're going to lift. You don't have to necessarily breathe after that, but certainly a lift. And then you have what we call a marcato at the end. Marcato. A marcato, and I'll write this down, a marcato is an accented staccato. So that's going to be a short note, but very loud. So an accented staccato, short and loud. The other textures in here are slurs, staccatos. You also have some legatos. I would advise you to not breathe after those. It seems like those are strategically placed in a crescendo here to make it sound just a little bit smoother and a little less clipped off. So slurs and staccatos, and of course that wonderful marcato at the very, very end. And then you have some what we call détaché, kind of a fancy name for semi-detached. 39 are détachés. There's no markings on top of those notes, so you just basically use a good, healthy two attack on those notes. So for now, oh, and there's a legato marking. Almost forgot that one. Legato marking pickup to measure 17. So that's going to be a full-length note, in that particular case. So that's it for now. The recording that I made, I have clipped it into 3 different parts. So part 1, then part 2, then part 3. And on this particular video, I'm using the initial tempo, which is 94, just for you to get your feet wet with this particular work. You want to be concentrating on your scale practice outside of this, maybe even some arpeggio work as well. And one last thing, and that is look out for measure 15. You do have some unusual markings in there. The C sharp, you'll want to make a note of the C sharp accidental carrying through to the last note of that measure, which is also a C sharp. And you might want to also remind yourself of the B flat. Sounds a little bit unusual in that area. The global key of this work is in the key of D minor, so it'll sound just a little bit dark to you. Thus the C sharps in some cases. The C sharps serve as the raised 7th note of the D minor scale. You might want to explore some D minor scales in your own practicing. So happy preparation.